For a century, they were lost in the wilderness, wet, cold, and hungry. And by the conventional measure, few in number. Of the state capital, you could count them on one hand. Then you needed two. And then you needed a calculator. The road to Republican dominance in Arkansas. What happened, why, and why it took as long as it did. A special edition of Arkansas Week coming up.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
Hello again, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. It had become the state's reigning political cliche. Victory in the Democratic primary, tantamount to election. That was then. After 100 years of post-Reconstruction Arkansas, the Democratic Party's grip on Arkansas politics at every level in almost every precinct began to loosen. And in the past decade, the Republican Party has prevailed in every statewide race, every congressional district, in the great majority of legislative districts, and in scores of county and local offices. A stunning reversal of fortune. But at its core, was Arkansas Republican even when it was Democratic? One of the questions we'll explore in this edition. Joining us, Dr. Heather Yates, Professor of Political Science at the University of Central Arkansas. Dr. Revis Edmonds is a staff historian at the Old State House Museum, and Bill Vickery, veteran Republican political strategist. And thanks to everybody for coming in. Dr. Edmonds, we're going to go to you first. And I should advise the audience that you are preparing for publication, a study of this very subject, yes. Republican ascendancy in Arkansas, if you will. What, at the end of your labors, have you concluded?
Well, at the end of my labors, I've concluded that, of course, the focus of that study was the 1990 Republican gubernatorial primary, which was probably the most watched primary election since the epic primary in 1972 between John McClellan and David Pryor. And the main focus of that study, beyond just the colorful personalities that were involved, were one, how did Arkansas get to this point? Was that many of our misconceptions, if you will, concerning how the so-called one-party monolith that was Arkansas was so much of a misconceptions. And I want to go back to a study, of course, the groundbreaking study on Southern politics that was done by V.O. Key. And Key described Arkansas, we think of Arkansas again in the years after Reconstruction, up to the 60s, 70s, 80s, as, quote, a one-party system. I more agree with Key. We had a no-party system. And let me explain how that comes.
Well, one party is no party, in effect.
Well, it is, but we think of a monolithic one party as being a organization that has its tentacles in every level of government up and down the line. That was not the case with the Arkansas Democratic Party because, one, our tradition, long-held tradition of localism, that we basically looked at the government in Little Rock as a necessary nuisance, more or less. And power and influence was held with local networks that revolved around colorful local personalities. And when you actually would have a statewide figure, let's say like Orville Faubus, that would rise and at least build an organization that was strong enough to at least maintain him in power, it still did not flow into any sort of party organization. And I go back to the Democratic Party in Arkansas through all those years. The Democratic Party was not an organization. It simply was a conduit, if you will, to collect filing fees and to finance primary elections, which at that time had to be paid for by the parties themselves. So it's why you didn't have Republican primaries and why you had one solid control at the local level, and everything did flow from the local level, and to an extent it still does.
Yeah. Heather?
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit of texture to what Revis has commented on about the history of the Democratic Party. And when we're talking about realignment of Arkansas from Democratic to Republican column 2, I think we need to draw some nuances here. We want to make sure that we are really talking about the realignment of the white Southern voter in Arkansas, and it's predicated on that history that Revis has pointed to. Also, we want to focus on, why was the Arkansas attachment to the Democratic Party really stubborn? I mean, in contrast to other Southern states, the attachment the state had to the Democratic Party was unsurpassed. And that is based on, yes, democratic traditions, local traditions, the party apparatus, the local election structures, and popular personalities. And so this really starts looking like a party machine styled politics. And what do I mean by that? Party machine styled politics in Arkansas does not look the way other party machines look elsewhere. And so for a long-standing time, Arkansas had been practicing candidate-centered politics, personality-centered politics, long before the nation ever nationalized that strategy in the 1956-1960 presidential election. So what we had here in Arkansas is this confederal arrangement of local network of party bosses at the county level. This would be the courthouse or county judge, county clerk, and they were really the political boss in that county. And so to win an election and to garner support at the local level, you had to win over the county judges. You had to win the local support. So we really kind of had this bottom up, this trickle up party styled machine apparatus. And then also that when we also were talking about what made Arkansas flip, right? We also want to think about long-term factors, short-term factors. Long-term factors, we've got this long-standing democratic tradition, this kind of machine-styled apparatus. We also have short-term factors, and that is we're going to get into the what does the primary apparatus look? Well, how do parties operate elections? It wasn't until 1995 were the primaries funded by filing fees paid to the party, not the state. And so you had single party rule that was locking out competition. So you would have multiple primary polling places for Democratic voters, but you'd have one polling place for Republicans. So up until just recently, 1995, not that long ago, you also had party competition locked out, okay? And also, we need to, at some point in time, turn our focus on what happened in 2008 and 2010, specifically with the reinvention of conservatism with the Tea Party, and the legacy also of the regional realignment that stemmed out of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So that's why I wanted to draw our attention, is that when we're talking about realignment, we're also talking about the realigning of the white Southern voter, because African American voting trends has been very consistent since the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So I also want to put that out there, that redefining conservatism also collapses into contemporary politics. Is now we've got this reconstruction echo of racial conservatism that gets consolidated in with party ideology now. So the actual academic term in the literature is racial antagonism. So we've also got that playing in the background.
Yeah. Bill Vickery.
Yeah, listen, just to amplify on what they both, the great points that they've made, is that there are some very sound and structural issues that changed. Oddly enough, they changed during a period of time when Asa Hutchinson in the early 90s was chairman of the Republican Party. I think, and very smartly they picked up on that, and that is, one, the state went to financing party primaries, which allowed the Republican Party to be on a level playing field in terms of opportunities in voting. That's big. It later plays a bigger role as the contrast really develops into the over the last decade. And so no longer did you have to drive, an hour round trip to go vote. That was really big. The nonpartisan election of judges also then kind of deprived hundreds of thousands of dollars in filing fees from the Democratic Party. That was a big move as well, while our now governor was then party chairman. And lastly, to some degree, term limits, because to pick up on, it was a Democratic Party, but the personalities were so over the top and large. They really drove the party activities, not the party activities driving the politicians. Unlike sort of more densely populated urban areas where you'd have a block captain, and that block captain reports up to this, and that was a party apparatus. Here, you had such a great collection of colorful personalities who then, at the local level, would engage.
We had fiefdoms.
Yes, yeah, very, very much so. So when term limits kicked in, then suddenly you had a level playing field in terms of opportunities to vote. You had the Democratic Party having to give up a ton of money in terms of filing fees because of nonpartisan election of judges. And then, to some degree, term limits play a role later on when we see this real contrast between national Democrats and national Republicans. And those were the real building blocks. And Asa Hutchinson actually did that as party chairman back then, and nobody really paid a lot of attention.
Well, what role ideology in all this? We've talked about the mechanics, the dynamics. Mm-hmm. The practicalities of politics, but at what point does ideology kick in?
I am not really at least in the period that I've worked with, I'm not seeing much where it did. It was basically all personality based, and the era that I was looking at, that I centered my research on, was that seminal Republican gubernatorial primary in 1990 between Sheffield Nelson and Tommy Robinson. And of course, to many probably our younger viewers at this point in time, those two names are probably as unfamiliar as a foreign language. But this was really the height of where personalities, like Bill said, personalities, drove the organization and the process. But ironically, neither one of these two men, despite all of the political talents that they brought to the table, neither one was capable of leading a statewide realignment. And let me elaborate. Sheffield Nelson, who had his biggest accomplishments in the corporate world, but yet had been a behind-the-scenes political player for all of his career. His background would suggest that he would fit the mold of what John Brummett referred to Mike Beebe, a transactionalist who would deal with issues from a nonpartisan standpoint, one issue at a time. Whereas, and again, another friend in the Little Rock area, we had back and forth discussed this, and I put this in my research. In effect, Tommy Robinson, at least in style, could have in fact been Arkansas's answer to Donald Trump, because he answered to the concerns of what had long been his base, rural, working class Arkansans. It might have played well if he had decided to go statewide in a Democratic primary. Once he switched over and ran in a Republican primary, those hinterlands that had been his base were suddenly closed to him because of what you mentioned, because of the limited number of Republican primaries in the smaller rural counties. We had that issue here in Faulkner County that particular year. There was an agreement between the Faulkner County Republican Party and the Democratic Central Committee, County Clerk, and the Election Commission, that there would be a joint sharing of the voting machines. This was unprecedented. And what happened? Well, numbers in the Republican primary increased 20-fold. What happens in 1991? Well, the Election Commission withdraws that agreement, leading to the lawsuit that now...
There was a little litigation.
A little bit of litigation, but at that same time, that was a tool that could at least benefited those two, or at least Sheffield, Nelson, but for sure, because the benefits of primary agreements like that came in counties where he was the strongest, outside of the 10,000 or more Democrats that crossed over in Pulaski County.
We have, Heather Yates mentioned, that basically when we talk about the realignment of Arkansas politics along partisan lines, we're talking about the white vote. To what extent was this the absolute propulsion of the Republican Party into dominance in Arkansas? How big a factor was race?
It's a factor. And it's a factor because if going back to the question about not partisanship, you asked about ideology. The Democratic Party in Arkansas, the historic roots of the Democratic Party is not the Democratic progressives of the 1930s, nor is it the brand of the Democratic progressives of current era, right? So the Arkansas voter is a socially conservative voter, okay? But practically, let's take a look at demographics because this matters, because one of the social factors is race. So when we're looking at what the white electorate looked like, and we're looking at how the colorful, strong, type A personalities controlled the Confederal network with the Democratic Party label, you had a relatively small electorate in Arkansas. What does that mean? You had a small portion of white voters who qualified to vote because you still had the active poll tax. When you have a small, poor demographic, a white poor demographic, that their livelihoods are largely dependent on the good nature of the county judges, those party bosses, the
sheriffs,
and the sheriffs, right?
Yeah.
So the local apparatus. Yeah. So you've got when we're asking about ideology, the ideology of whom? The leadership or the voters? The voters are aimed at maintaining their livelihood. It is an economic factor, but then that parlays into a white, democratic, socially conservative voter. Now, the 1930s galvanizes this Democratic voting bloc because while the state of Arkansas did not get as battered as the other states in comparison from the Civil War, it is the Great Depression that really took Arkansas for a ride. Arkansas did not fare very well. So you have this political socializing event of an entire generation. So FDR Democrat, lockstep. Okay, but not the progressive New York FDR Democrat. Okay, so let's then factor race into this. Let's talk about the demographics of the state. The state is a relatively homogenous population, meaning you have an 85% white voting electorate. Even that number holds today. You have about only 9 counties in the Delta area that consistently vote Democrat. And you also have the historical legacy of segregation in the state that is pretty, and you look at this across the South, okay? So you still have the social legacy of segregation. You still have the segregated neighborhoods and whatnot. Race plays a factor because what race signifies to the Democratic Party heading into, past 1965, heading into 2008, where now we have Barack Obama on the national ticket, a black man running for an institution that, on a side note here, here's a path-dependent organization that is not only a masculine space, it is a white space. So we have a black man running for a white space, and this is the physical manifestation signaling to the conservative Democrat, the voter, and I'm not talking about elite queuing, I'm just talking about the voter in Arkansas, that this is a real physical manifestation representing a different direction of the party, and the defection occurs. We see that and we see it in Arkansas, that we could say it's a critical election because it is sudden shift in voting patterns. And so we have kind of like the final last stage of defection in Arkansas. And then after that, in 2010, we have the first majority take over at the state legislative level. And that is the year of the Tea Party nationwide. We see the redefined conservative movement in the Tea Party movement really take over a lot of state legislatures. And that's kind of where this all kind of circles around and pivots. Even 2019 politics is still very much influenced by what happened a decade ago.
Yeah, and in fact, redefined populism in a way. Bill,
well, you know what's interesting is what both of these two very smart people have pointed out is in total contrast to what the average Politico has touted over the years, and that's the independence of the Arkansas voter, where you could vote for Nixon and Fulbright.
Well, 68, was the
all
classic
these.
year, yeah.
But what we're really talking about is there was a thread of consistency throughout all of those votes, and so while we touted this independence, I would agree completely that it really was a little more monolithic than we want to really pay attention to, and so it has. Culturally, it has always been there, the center-right voter dominating Arkansas politics, but driven by sort of race and socioeconomic standing. I think that's a big deal.
Yeah, and along with race, you had the ever nearer, closer identification of Democratic Party with such cultural shifts. You had gay marriage, you had abortion.
Yeah.
That a great many Democrats, it would appear, suddenly decided that they were far more comfortable ideologically or practically speaking with the party which had chosen to reject those.
From a consulting standpoint, you could see this coming. I mean, it's the intersection of technology and the ability to then contrast a leading figure, as they were just pointing to, in this case it's President Obama, his policies, what he was pushing, the agenda he was pushing, and all those that were associated with it at the national level. Then you have sort of the decentralization of communication, Twitter, Facebook, social media, all that stuff, as well as the rise of Fox News, all of that defining what is happening by the Democratic Party throughout the state. You add to that all these structural things that we said earlier, and you get a clear contrast for the first time in a very long time between the D's and the R's. Really, what Clinton was able to keep at bay for many years as a favorite son of the state, and what you saw in terms of some other office holders, big personalities, wanting to be more conservative, aligning themselves with President Bush when he was president, and sort of a neighboring friend. All of that suddenly goes out the window, and for the first time, Republicans are able to truly take advantage from a messaging standpoint, and that is to say, look, these people don't believe the way you believe, and you've got the opportunity now to vote and have an impact. That, along with the Tea Party and that movement, all of those disaffected folks, they came to the table at one time, and that's why the shift was so dramatic. I mean, you could leave Arkansas and come back 5 years later, and it is completely flipped from one of the most Democratic-controlled legislatures in the country to one of the most Republican-controlled legislatures. And so just a dramatic, and possibly the fastest shift that we've seen happen throughout the country.
Yeah, Heather Yates, what now for the Republican majority? How to maintain it? Does it have to, what?
Well, the perils of one-party rule are the perils whether the Democrats have dominance or the Republicans have dominance. And so you've got a couple of scenarios that are going to play out, right? So are the Republicans going to govern with their supermajority of like, now it's our turn and now it's our turn to set election rules in a way that locks out our opponents and gives us the advantage? Well, this state legislature already has a little pet tool in their toolbox, and that's redistricting, right? You know, to redraw lines to help your electoral advantage. But the perils of, the one-party dominance, if the Republicans want to maintain the appeal of the Republican label just the way that the big personalities in the Democratic Party did, as a side note, it's not that the Democrats had this universal appeal. It's that they kept the appeal of the Democratic label alive or sustainable just enough. And the Republicans, it's not that they're going to have universal support. Will they be able to keep the appeal of their policy agenda alive just enough? And sometimes in politics, and Bill Vickery, you might know this better than anybody else, just enough sometimes is all you need to get across the finish line. So on the policy agenda, it's going to be, the Republicans are going to need to, well, they're at an advantage because the Arkansas voter has already leaned toward that conservatism, social conservatism. So they've already got some advantage there. They've already implementing a policy agenda that serves the social conservative interest. Now, they don't want to push their luck. They don't want to go so far in that direction that then they lose that universal appeal and support.
Yeah, Bill Vickery, 50 plus 1.
Yeah, and well, I think that's it. I do get the sense that there is an understanding amongst the personalities who are now Republicans who are in power, in that there is a sensitivity. You know, it's the first generation to become empowered, and we've been on the outside for a very long period of time. I'll be curious to come back in 20 years, because then you start to move away from everyone who remembers what it was like to be on the outside and have a sensitivity to that in terms of institutionally how you govern. You end up with the grandkids later on who don't remember what it was like when the business was founded, and that's where we tend to spiral out of control, I think.
Yeah, wish we could continue, but we're simply out of time. To the three of you, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thanks to you for watching. See you next time.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.